Hey everyone, Dan here. Let's take a look today at open source and why I think it's so great. If you're an educator, if you're in education, the education field, whether a teacher or an administrator or a consultant, you should really consider using these tools in schools, in your classroom, because there's lots of options available to you. Um, Open source essentially means that it's free software that can be the source code of the software can be accessed and edited and copied and basically remixed. These different bullet points here come from the opensource.org website, and what I like about their definitions is they get a little specific on some areas. So, for example, um, in order for it to qualify as open source, it can't be discriminatory. For example, you can't create open source software that says you can't use this in your business, or people who are in the technology computer building field cannot use this software. It has to be available to everyone, and if you restrict that, then it's technically not open source. You have to be able to distribute unlimited numbers of licenses. You can't say, oh, well, you only get 10 licenses, or it's not considered open source. And it has to be technology neutral. And I think that's a really important piece because when we look at some open source softwares, like the program I'm running right now called Cam Studio, which is doing the screen recording, is limited to Windows. So technically, it wouldn't be entirely open source, even though they call themselves open source, because it wouldn't run on a Mac computer. So speaking of different programs, there are anything from media editing to office type programs like what you're looking at right now is a version of what's called LibreOffice, and this is their presentation version. There's of course OpenOffice. Um, OX Text is an interesting new web-based version to compete with Google Drive, and then of course some more familiar ones like WordPress. There's a full list of these apps at Lifehacker with links to check them out. So please take a look at the link at the bottom and go visit it. And some more popular open source softwares include Android and Linux. You've probably heard of them, Android phones and Linux computer operating system. But let's get into why open source. So one of the big reasons people like open source, that if you go kind of Google search it or search out there, is that it's free. And I put on there generally free because if you get into some programs, you might find cost involved, but they still refer to themselves as open source. Be wary of that because they might have hidden agendas, but generally it's free. And there's no licensing limits, meaning an unlimited number of users could use it. So if you are wanting to purchase this for 500 people, hey, no worries, you're not going to get charged for that. You can make anything that you make can be made private, or you can decide to give that back to the larger development community. Generally, open source developers, or if you create something, the way that it continues to grow is if you give back to the community. So it's important that anyone who's using open source realize that and say, hey, if I develop something new, I want to give back, or it generally won't grow. Control is really nice because you can control the code and make it fit your needs. That's why a lot of businesses use open source programs, because they can change the code and make it fit what they want it to do depending on the program that they're using. These are some interesting statistics I found on a PC Mag article, but Accenture, a big consulting firm, found that 2/3 of businesses invest in open source programs, and Xenos, a software company, did their own study and said that 98% of businesses utilize some aspects of open source software. So you can see that it's really popular in the business field, mainly because, as I mentioned before, they have control. The cost is very limited and they can relicense it. One of the more interesting pieces, though, is that they found that only 29% of those businesses actually recontribute back to the open source community. And so when I say can make new content private, that's what a lot of these businesses do. They take the content and they make it private and they don't contribute to the larger development community, which can be a problem for open source, which we'll touch on in a little bit. So why might you want to use it in your classroom? Well, again, it's free. Um, in a New York Times article in 2010, $1.89 billion was spent by schools in 2010 on software for the classroom. So if you're looking at that as a budget, what could we spend as schools if all of our software was free? If we didn't have to pay for any of it, $1.89 billion could go a long way, especially to hardware. If you think of things like if we wanted to buy laptops for all of our kids. Again, unlimited licensing, so if you have a school of 600 kids, no worries, you can give as many copies as you want. There are mods made specifically by the development community for education, so you don't have to be a developer to use open source, but if you want to do something specific to the classroom, you can go find various extensions through searching and finding those programs to modify your open source program to fit your needs. And again, it has to be compatible with most operating systems. Again, I found some software like Cam Studio that is not compatible with Mac, so I don't know if it necessarily qualifies as open source, even though it would be labeled as open source by the developers. And of course, you can control what you use. One of the things I ran into, though, is that there really is two ideas around open source. So there's this idea that open source is free, and then there's just the people who call themselves open source. And so the people who would define themselves as free don't focus on cost, they focus on the freedom of the user to do what they want. And they see themselves as creating a social movement to where people focus on the freedom of the idea of software being free and being able to edit and rebuild software and share and remix as more of this social movement. So it's kind of an attitude towards software versus the open source movement. It sees it as a development movement, meaning that if I have access to open source, then I can redevelop it. And so I'm only focusing on the software itself. I'm not focusing on the idea that all software should be this way. And so a good comparison I heard a few times on the internet was that people who view it as free software, and not again, not cost, but just free as in free social software or free socially, see it as free speech versus open source would see theirs as free beer. Because beer normally costs, so it's free, it doesn't cost you anything. Free speech, on the other hand, is kind of the social right and an ideal. And that the software is not restricted. So if you're into free software, it cannot be restricted. Going back to those 10 bullet points at the beginning from the open source blog, as to where some of the open source programs can restrict what devices run the software, which they call tivoization. And an example would be the Android operating system can sometimes restrict what devices can run that software. And so that would not necessarily be considered free software, although the open source community would define it as open source. I think even though we see these various aspects, kind of pros and cons, one of the big pros that I found was from Terry Vessels, and he wrote this quote, that we are well into the beginnings of the information age. It stands to affect the people of the world at least as profoundly as the industrial age. It is time for the opening of the tools that will be needed to build this new age. Teaching our children to be passive purchasers of closed, proprietary solutions to problems is not enough. Constraining students to move the mouse within the confines of the instruction set of a few closed proprietary programs merely cages those students and constrains our future. So I think what Terry's really getting at here is huge. It's not about the tool necessarily. It's this idea that they are consumers and they need to understand and push and change the software and the programs that are being developed, and not be the passive purchasers who just use whatever they get. This is kind of a big argument against a lot of things like iPads and stuff like that, because our kids are growing up where they purchase cell phones and computers, and they just consume all the content, and they're not creators. And so by using open source in your classrooms, you really are missing the point unless you help students understand the open source software and how they can modify it to their personal needs. And so, for example, in high school level, you could actually get into the source code and edit it, but at lower elementary levels where kids aren't necessarily going to understand the idea of coding and stuff like that, just being aware of it and understanding that, hey, this system here is closed and you can't edit it, but this system's open and we can edit it and we can change and make it fit our needs, helps students become more active as they grow up in their technology world, to see these closed technology systems that are being given to us and these open systems which they can create into what they need it to be. So some issues with open source are that if you look at open source as a whole, there are a few very successful programs. So if you go back to that Lifehacker site, there's probably 50 to 75, 100 great programs. But if you go and look at some sites like GitHub, which hosts a lot of open source programs for download, there are hundreds of thousands that are kind of abandoned and lying around. And a big reason for that is that these developers are working for free. These are all like side projects. And so you're not getting the same dedication as a full-time team at Microsoft who's getting paid to build these programs and constantly bringing updates and fixes and all that kind of stuff. So it you don't get necessarily the same level of dedication. And even programs like OpenOffice were developed by people who were getting paid through Oracle to kind of build these programs, or Sun Microsystems. And so the development it really relies heavily on the development community, and the developers wait for donations, and so there's not a lot of money backing these open source programs, and so that leads to this not as innovative approach, because to sit like the guys at Apple who sit there and churn out these really innovative ideas, they're getting paid a lot of money to sit in these rooms and do that, versus the development community, which is doing it on the side, is probably going to copy ideas rather than innovate these free open source ideas. And of course, open source software can be really demanding for an average user. Even earlier, I was trying to run some issues with Cam Studio, and it wasn't running on my computer. And so I had to go and download some extra software patches and stuff. And so it was more complicated to use Cam Studio than it was to be able to use a program like Screencast-O-Matic, which isn't open source, but it's really easy to use. So there can be some issues with usability. So in conclusion, open source is great for those who are looking to save money, who want control over their software, who feel that they would like to contribute to the development community and want to be exposed to what's going on behind the scenes of their software, and don't want to be those passive consumers, but actually take part in what they're using. There are so many benefits, I think, of being able to have control over your software. For example, I do use Android, even though some would argue that's not technically open source. With Android, there's a whole development community where we create customized themes. We can do wireless tethering. We can do audio modifications. There's so many things we can do to enhance the software that Google or manufacturers like Samsung wouldn't do on their own, and so it's left up to us. And I can even use programs like this LibreOffice, where I can hop on and get into these extensions like PDF import, where I can import a PDF and edit it, which if you were to buy that kind of technology from Adobe, it would cost you. Or even Presentation Minimizer, which compresses your presentation files into a small file so you can email it more easily. And so as long as open source exists, these kinds of modifications can be made, which are very beneficial. But of course, it can be complicated. I had some issues even today getting Cam Studio to work, and there are some free softwares that aren't open source, like Screencast-O-Matic, for example, which allow you to do the same thing. Now, I can't do a lot of modifications to it, and there's no development community, but it's easy to use and it's free. And so you have to make a decision about if that particular open source software is correct for you. And you have to keep in mind that you may not see as many updates or that much support for your open source software that you choose. So my recommendation is get out there, go to Lifehacker, download some of these programs, try them out, find the things that you like, and look at the development for those programs to see what's available to you, and enjoy it. Open source is good for development, and if you have any questions, please leave a comment on my blog or get in touch with me on Twitter at get_sharp.